Episode 15 begins at the Raven House, where the Starlight Girls, and along with Dance, aka Giselle Damarack, were doing their workout. And they were listening to KMEL, which, according to Ashley, is always plays all the music by the Holograms. And speaking of music, they go into a montage of a workout song called It's Only Me and the Music from last season. So when the song came to an end, we go into the KMEL radio station. The station, by the way, was owned by a guy by Mr. Marcus. We're about to meet him in just a minute. So speaking of which, he just asked his two engineers who decided to quit on the spot. And they told him why. Because they said that KBST, which is the rival radio station, has offered them more money. So after that, they left. Then, minutes later, Mr. Kite, who's Adrian's assistant, shows up with a contract in his hand. He said that his client, named Adrian, who we're about to meet later, has offered Mr. Marcus a better deal. As both Mr. Kite and Mr. Marcus continued to have a conversation with each other, they were not aware that listening in was Mondo and his friend by the name of Switch, and all the other friends had worked at the radio station. So Mr. Kite was asking Mr. Marcus, well, what's your decision? Anyway, after Mr. Marcus realizes that he has no choice, unaware of this news, that's when Marcus was told by Switch, wait a minute. So Switch goes first to speak in his case to say, we can help you. Let us run things for you. Then Mondo, who agrees with Switch, has come up with a suggestion that with more volunteers, we can make the best college radio there is. Mr. Marcus, who agrees with Mondo, but said that he wasn't sure about this idea. So Switch came up with a better suggestion and says, I'll tell you what we'll do. If you could give us some time before you go off the air, I'm sure we'll find somebody to pay the bills for you. After Mr. Marcus had thought about Switch's idea and Mondo's suggestion, he throws the contract on the ground and says, as much as I hate ultimatums like this. So finally, Mr. Marcus agrees with Mondo and his friends and says, okay, you have until then. Mr. Kite, who is disappointed and disgusted, picks the contract off the ground and says, you'll regret for making this decision. So after that, he left. So later at the KBST radio station, that's Adrian. He's the rival of Mr. Marcus, and with him were the Misfits and Eric. So Adrian demands to know from Eric what favor he wants from him. Well, Eric was more than happy to explain. He says, all I ever want was for the Misfits to have more airplay, that's all. But that's not all, Eric says. It will include more interviews and, of course, some promotions here and there. Of course, Adrian was not so sure of it. So he's asking Eric, are you here to talk business or are you going to waste some time with me? So Eric says, listen to me. I can pay you more money if you play Misfits music. Well, this kind of practice is very illegal. It's known as the payola practice. And back in the 50s, it's very illegal, as it is now. So after Adrian was convinced otherwise that the Misfits music would be played on KBST, he seems delighted with it and says, now you're talking. So then minutes later, Adrian's assistant, Mr. Kite, just came in to tell him the bad news. So after Eric and the Misfits was escorted out, Mr. Kite has a pleasant conversation with Adrian to explain why KMEL wasn't being sold yet by Mr. Marcus. Then Mr. Kite says, wait, there's more. Here's a bigger problem. Some kids who works at the radio station has given Mr. Marcus some time before sun off to sign a contract. So Adrian, after he heard the bad news, he told his assistant Mr. Kite that he'll do whatever's necessary to get the radio station off the air. And yet Adrian just let slip to tell him why. Because he said that once upon a time he used to work for Mr. Marcus. That was until Mr. Marcus just catches Adrian in the act for doing illegal practices. Well, that kind of illegal practice, according to what Adrian said when he explains further, that led to Adrian being fired, and now he wanted revenge because of that. Then Adrian told his assistant, Mr. Kite, to not worry about it because he said that there's no way that those college kids are going to pull this off before the sign off time. So, meanwhile, at the college cafeteria, Switch, Mondo, and their friends were talking about who's going to save KMEL and what they're going to do about it. Then Switch looks over at the magazine that the young girl that was sitting next to him over his shoulder, and said, "That's it. If there's only one person that could save KMEL, then that would be Jim. She can help us out. She can back us up." Mondo, who agrees with Switch, said that he can go along with him, but under one condition: if they split up. So Mondo agrees to check out Starlight Mansion, while Switch, meanwhile, goes to Starlight Music. So meanwhile, there, Switch realizes that Jim and the Holograms weren't there. He learned this by the receptionist who works there. He said that they're at the Cloud9 restaurant, so following the receptionist's suggestion, Switch heads straight to the Cloud9 restaurant. So meanwhile there, Jim and her bandmates were not only there, but so was Rio. And of course, there's a hangar right next door to the restaurant. And of course, Rio had a surprise for Jim that earlier on he just got a private plane for himself. So at the hangar, by the time that Jim looks at the plane that Rio had, she seems impressed. But both Jim and Rio were not aware that Rio's not the only person who has a plane for himself. There's a guy by the name of McDuffie. He has a plane too, and he just insulted Rio. So Rio and Jim head back inside the restaurant, not knowing that catching up with them was Switch. He's an old friend of Jerica and Kimber's, but for some reason the waiter wouldn't allow Switch inside. But Switch wouldn't give up this easy since Plan A didn't work, so he has Plan B in mind by climbing over a fence. But the policeman soon catches him in the act. Now Switch, who was ashamed, got approached by McDuffie and his co-pilot. Now remember, McDuffie was the one that insulted Rio earlier about his airplane. So McDuffie's co-pilot says, if you wanted to get in so bad, all you have to do is give us $50 and maybe we can help you with that. At first, Switch wasn't sure about this idea, but realizes that he had no choice. Now that he's in McDuffie's plane, Switch that is. So you're probably wondering, what was Switch's plan C? To parachute his way in. Well, good news for Switch, he pulled the parachute cords to pop a parachute. Then, down below, one of Jim's friends says, "Look up in the sky! Someone is coming this way down." Jim and her bandmates panic and says, "Everybody run for it." Well, except for Kimber, of course. And on Switch's way down, he snapped the power lines. Luckily for Kimber, she got under her keyboard and just in time, too. Well, good news with Switch, he landed on the stage and intact. Also the good news, Switch went under the keyboard to where Kimber was hiding at. As for Rio, he told the waiter to call the power company to shut off the power lines. Jim and her bandmates wanted to know if Kimber is okay. Don't worry, she'll be fine. Back with Switch, who is underneath the keyboard with Kimber, he not only remembers Kimber from school, but also her sister Jerica. So while Switch was having a conversation with Kimber, the rest of her bandmates took the parachute off the keyboard, and by surprise, that's when they saw Switch, who's an old friend of both Kimber's and Jerica's from school back in the day. When Rio shows up minutes later, he grabs Switch by his shirt and says, "Do you realize what you did? Your stunt could have gotten us hurt, or worst of all, killed." But Switch pleaded his case to say, "That's not my idea, because McDuffie was in on it too." And that's when both Switch and Rio saw up above McDuffie's plane flying by. Then Jim has her turn to speak in her case to say, "That may be true, but that doesn't explain why you're here." So Switch has his turn to plead his case to tell Jim the bad news. So Switch went first to speak in his case to say, "Listen, we got a serious situation at hand. Mr. Marcus, who owns KMEL, is in serious trouble. Well, not just him, but also the station itself. And worst of it all is that Mr. Marcus is going off the air at any time." Then Switch says, "Wait, there's more. Mr. Marcus has agreed to let myself and my friends make it into a college station, and only you can back us up. You can help us." "So let me get this straight. You want us to help you?" Jim asked. "Please," Switch says, "you're our only hope. Because if you don't help KMEL and soon, KBST is going to buy them out. And worst of all, Mr. Marcus will be out of business. And worst of it all, it's going to be a catastrophe." "Gee," Jim said to Switch, "I wish we can help you." But Jim said that there's a problem. Starlight Music already has a charity foundation, which is the foster home for girls. Then it's Kimber's turn to speak in her case to say, "Jim, this is serious. What are we going to do about it?" Well, Jim says, as it is, we already got too many obligations, and then told Switch the bad news to say, I'm sorry, but there's not much we can do. So Switch, now hanging his head in shame, decides to leave. And now poor Switch is left to wonder how he's going to break this bad news to Mr. Marcus when he gets back to the radio station. So meanwhile there, when Switch and his friends came back, they told Mr. Marcus what had happened. After hearing the bad news, that's when Mr. Marcus says, well, you did your best, but now there's nothing we could do. So there's only one thing left for Mr. Marcus to do, was to tell everybody the bad news that KMEL is signing off for good, forever, after so many years. After Jerka in her upstairs office at Starlight Music had heard this heartbreaking news, she now realized what she must do. But the question is, what to do about it and how? Jerica, after she left her upstairs office, changed herself into Jim while driving in a glittering gold roadster, heads to the KMEL radio station. So back at the radio station, after Mr. Marcus has his final say and told a final goodbye to all the radio fans, that's when Mr. Kite, who's Adrian's assistant, came back minutes later and with a contract in his hand. So when Mr. Kite was asking Mr. Marcus, are you ready to sign a contract now? Well, Mr. Marcus says, I guess I have no choice. It's hopeless. No, it's not, Jim's voice said. It's not over yet, not by a long shot. Switch and his friends just couldn't believe it. Jim just showed up at the last minute. And she told everyone, listen, Jerga just told me the good news. She also said that there's an offer for Mr. Marcus that's even better. But he already has a deal, Mr. Kite said. Then Jim says, wait, there's more, because even better, Starlight Music was more than happy to be partners with this radio station. So you know what this means. Jim and her bandmates were more than happy to back up the radio station in any way that they could. But that's not all, Jim says. We'll help you pay the bills. After Switch and his friends had heard the good news from Jim, they cheered and overjoyed, and that made Mr. Marcus happy, and he shook Jim's hand. As you can tell, Mr. Kite is not happy about this. He made a final threat clear to Marcus to say, you're finished, do you hear me? Mondo decided to close the door on Mr. Kite, despite his biggest threat. So Mondo decided to ask Jim a question. So what's the plan? Well, about a week from now, Jim explains that Jericho will organize a meeting. Mr. Marcus, who agrees with Jim on Jericho's decision to have a meeting, he says this will bring a fresh new start to the station itself. So Mr. Marcus came up with a suggestion to have some call letters and a brand new image in itself. That's a good idea, Mondo said. So Mondo decided to have a conversation with his friends to ask what they thought of it. So after Switch, Mondo, and his friends had thought it over, so Switch came up with a suggestion. What if we can give a station a new name? And Switch says, even better, Jim, we can name it after you. It'll be KJEM. And Jim likes that idea. So, yep, you know what this means. Jim herself is going to have her first radio station in history. So, 1 week later, Jerga did exactly as she planned, formed a meeting, and with a little help from all the volunteers, including Rio, who agreed to replace all the equipment until Mr. Marcus said that he can afford to buy some new equipment. And with a few volunteers on the way, and let's not forget Mondo, Switch, and his friends who helped out also, KJAEM is going to be the first radio station in history. So back at Jerica's upstairs office at Starlight Music, the advertisement is already getting underway. And that's when the holograms, including Jerica, just saw Rio's plane flying above. And as you may have guessed it, he did a wonderful job advertising. I do say so myself. Meanwhile, at the KBST radio station, the only person that's not happy about it at all is Adrian. So after Mr. Kite had heard from Adrian, he just wants the radio station off the air permanently. He says, relax, don't worry about it. I got a plan, as any bad guy would do. So, what was Mr. Kite's plan? He told Adrian that he can use Eric Raymond and the Misfits to do a favor for him. However, Adrian made that threat clear to Mr. Kite to say, I don't care what you do, just do it. And if you fail me this time, you'll never work here again. So after that, Mr. Kite left. So later at Eric's upstairs office, when Mr. Kite came to see Eric and the Misfits, after Mr. Kite had discussed a favor he wants from Eric to borrow the Misfits for a while, Eric says, "Okay, you got yourself a deal." When Pizzazz shows up minutes later, she did not like what Eric was playing with Mr. Kite. So Eric says, "Down now, Pizzazz, calm down. Everything's under control." Then Pizzazz remembers Mr. Kite very well. He was the same guy from KBST, Adrian's assistant, that is. So now Pizzazz wants to know from Mr. Kite what kind of favor that he wants from the Misfits. Well, there's some good news. We're going to use you for an airplane to get rid of Cajun. The radio station is right here. Now you can tell that Pizzazz and the Misfits seem delightful with this idea from Mr. Kite. So what time they're going to be at the KBST studio? Eric asked. "Don't worry about it," Mr. Kite says. "I'll send the limousine to pick up the Misfits right away." So anyway, that's what Mr. Kite did after he and the Misfits left Eric's office. Anyway, after the Misfits got into the limousine that's parked outside of Misfits Music, Mr. Kite's the one that's driving the car. But then Pizzazz sensed that something was off and says, "Wait a minute, this isn't the way to KBST." "Don't worry about it," Mr. Kite says. "I'm sure that you girls can have a performance that's even better." So what the Misfits were unaware of is that Mr. Kite didn't take them to the KBST. He's taking them to the airport instead. So meanwhile, at the KJEM radio station, inside the recording studio, thanks to Rio installing some new equipment, the KGM radio station is ready to go. The audience cheered, and even better, there's going to be a live performance by the Holograms themselves. Meanwhile, back with Mr. Kite and the Misfits now inside of the recording studio in McDuffie's plane. So, before Mr. Kite heads off, he told the Misfits, "Now listen up. All you have to do is just watch the lights, and when the light turns green, you're ready to go." So, you know what this means? That means the Misfits were unaware that this was all a trick by Mr. Kite, but they were not aware of it yet. Back at the K Jim radio station, and just when things were going well with K Jim being the first radio station in history, thanks to Mr. Kite who hits the controls back in the control room of McDuffie's plane, you know what this means? That means the Misfits go into a montage of "Listen Up." While the song continues to play back at the KGM radio station, Jim comes in to the recording studio to say, "What's going on?" Then suddenly, Mr. Marcus, Rio, and Jim just heard Mr. Kite's voice saying, "Forget Jim and the holograms, the Misfits are here. From now on, we're taking over your station. This is a serious problem." So Jim wants to know from Mr. Marcus and Rio, "Can't you do anything?" So Rio was more than happy to answer that and said, "Well, whatever's going on around here, all I can tell you is that something or someone is jamming our signal." Mr. Marcus, meanwhile, says, "I know what to do." So he decided to call the FCC to find out what's going on. Back with the Misfits, they continue to perform inside a recording studio the way it's planned, inside of McDuffie's plane, that is. Back at the KGM radio station, you can tell that radio fans are getting upset, annoyed, and disgusted. So by the time the FCC did show up, the man at the FCC just told the holograms the good news. There are fans everywhere, from the zoo to the nearby park, everywhere, to find out where that source is coming from and what was going on. Then, meanwhile, one of the Switch's friends is in a serious situation from one of the sponsors and demanded to know why aren't they on the air and they want the money back. So she ran back inside the KGM radio station to discuss this situation with Jim. So when Jim changed into Jerica, so when one of Switch's friends explained the situation to Jerica, it says, "The sponsors are getting upset. They demanded their money back. What are we going to do?" So after Jerica found out about the situation from one of Switch's friends, she says, "Okay, try to keep the sponsors calm as much as you can. I'll go find out what's going on." So she ran up to join up with Rio, and of course the guy from the FCC, who has no idea what is going on and why isn't the signal picking up anywhere. So Rio, who agrees with the man from the FCC, saying something weird is going on. There must be an explanation for all of this. Don't worry, Jericho says. I'll find an explanation. So guess what she did? She decided to confront with Eric at Miss Music. Later, at Eric's upstairs office, while tuning into the radio to find the station that the Misfits were supposed to be on, he couldn't figure out what is going on and why aren't they there at KBST like they were supposed to. But then Jerica storms into his office and says, "Try K Jim." Then Eric looked at her like, "What did you say?" Then Jerica says, "Don't play games with me, just tell me where they are." Well, Eric finds this very hard to believe and then tells Jerica that the Misfits were supposed to be at KBST instead. So Eric says, "Look, Jerica, I know this sounds crazy, but Mr. Kite was supposed to take them to KBST, but they weren't there." Well, for once, Jerica finds this hard to believe, but for once, Eric was telling her the truth. So Jerka says, "I'm glad you confessed because not even you yourself could sink so low." So you know what this means? That means Eric and Jerka has to get to KBST to confront with Adrian. So that's what they did. So, at the KBST radio station, that's when Eric and Jurga decide to confront with Adrian. Then Eric got upset and then told Adrian, "You must have set me up somehow." But Adrian told Eric to prove it. So Eric decided to tell Adrian the bad news that his right hand guy, Mr. Kite, has made a deal with Eric instead of Adrian. But Adrian tries to deny it. So then Eric was asked by Adrian if Mr. Kite had ever mentioned his name, but Eric said that he didn't. Then Adrian was asking Eric if Mr. Kite had ever mentioned the station's name in any way, but again, Eric said no. "Well, you have no proof of it," Adrian says. So before Jerica can leave, she says, "I will get K Jim on the air one way or another." "Well, I would like to see you try it," Adrian said. So after that, she and Eric left. Back at the K Jim radio station, when Jerica and Eric met up with Mr. Marcus in Rio and the guy from the FCC finds this very weird. Then they had no idea. And why the source isn't found anywhere? Well, it didn't just appear out of thin air, Rio says, but then they saw McDuffie's plane flying above, and that's when they should have realized from the beginning that the pirate broadcasting has come from McDuffie's plane. Now that Rio knew what was going on, he decided to head to the Cloud9 hangar right next door to the restaurant where Jim and the Holograms had performed earlier. And so Jerica and her friends decides to catch up with him. So even though Rio has no idea what he's about to do, but he's going to do something about it. So, long story short, now that Rio's plane is attacking McDuffie's plane up in the sky, and then after that, both planes had landed intact, with Mr. Kite and the Misfits being arrested when both of the planes landed on the ground. So, before the Misfits were being arrested and taken away, Pizzazz screams out loud and says, "We had no idea that Mr. Kite was tricking us. We're innocent." Anyway, after the mistress and Mr. Kite was taken away, Jurga felt bad because for once the mistress had nothing to do with it. Instead, Mr. Kite's about to be arrested for pirate broadcasting without permission, and of course the mistress being the victims of it. "Well," Rio said, "cheer up. I'm sure Eric will bail them out tomorrow, but in the meantime we got a radio station to run." So back at the KGM radio station, the first thing that Mondo did by the time that the station got on the air was to apologize to the audience for the delay and a slight interference. KGM went on as planned. And what better way for the holograms to perform the way it's planned with their song of their own, a radio theme song to be exact, called KGM. So thanks to Mondo, Switch, and his friends, and of course Mr. Marcus on the way, the Holograms got their first radio station in history. And so that ends episode 15 after the song came to an end.